The file in my hands was dated March 14th, 1893. It was written in iron gall ink. The admission paper was so old, the edges had turned the color of weak tea. The fiber was soft enough that I could feel it bending under its own weight through my cotton gloves. I was scanning it face down on the Epson flatbed at Station 2 in the basement archive of the New Mexico Behavioral Health Institute, the building they used to call the Territorial Insane Asylum. And I wasn't reading the content, not yet. The digitization protocol said scan first, catalog second, do not interpret. So I scanned it, waited for the light bar to pass, lifted the lid, and flipped the page to check the resolution on my monitor. The scanner made a low mechanical hum as the page passed under the light, and the fluorescent tubes overhead clicked once in their housing. And there was my name, not a name like mine. My name, full legal name, middle initial included, with my date of birth written in a hand that had been dead for over a century. Below that, in the same ink, in the same controlled cursive, was a field labeled admission date, and the date written there was today's. Tonight, 11:40 p.m. It was 9:16 when I read it. I need to tell you something about why I was in that basement at all, because it matters. I owed $18,400. Not to a bank, to a man named Purcell, who ran a private collections outfit out of El Paso. He had built a penalty clause into the repayment agreement that added 11% for every week past the due date. The due date was 21 days away. I had signed the agreement because I was stupid and because I was desperate and because Purcell's paralegal told me the clause was standard language. The contract digitization job at the Institute paid $42 an hour for night shifts. The shifts ran from 8 p.m. to 4 a.m., and I had taken every available slot for the next 3 weeks because the math worked out to just barely enough. I could not quit. I could not lose a single shift. Whatever was on that file, I could not afford to walk away from that building. So I sat there, in the basement archive, wearing cotton gloves and looking at my own name on a document that was 131 years old. And I did not leave. That was the first mistake. The archive wing of the Institute sits underneath the original 1889 structure. The structure is a heavy Romanesque sandstone building set back from Hot Springs Boulevard behind a lawn that doesn't get watered enough. The basement was converted into a records facility sometime in the 70s, and it still has that look. Drop ceiling tiles, fluorescent tubes that hum at a frequency you feel more in your teeth than your ears. Industrial carpet worn down to a gray felt path between the file cabinets. There are 4 digitization stations, each with a flatbed scanner, an adjustable document cradle, a task lamp, and a monitor. I was the only contractor on shift that night. There had been 2 of us until the previous Thursday. The other one was Daniel Reyes. Daniel had been working the project for about 6 weeks before I started. I only overlapped with him for 9 shifts. He was quiet, thorough, wore the same gray hoodie every night, and had a habit of marking his cotton gloves with a felt-tip pen, a small dot on the left thumb, so he could tell which pair was his. He'd leave notes in the digitization log, not just the standard metadata, but small observations. Things like ink composition changes mid-page, or secondary hand begins at line 14, likely institutional staff. He was good at the work. He noticed things. On my 10th shift, Daniel wasn't there. His station was cleared. His log was gone. His last pair of gloves, the ones with the dot on the thumb, were sitting on the scanner lid at Station 3, folded neatly, with one word written across the palm in his own felt-tip handwriting. Admitted. I asked Margaret Hale about it. Margaret Hale was the archive supervisor. She was somewhere in her late 50s, lean, with short gray hair and reading glasses she wore on a beaded chain. She had the kind of calm that didn't feel like patience. It felt like economy. She never said more than she had to. Every sentence had the quality of a prepared statement, like she had rehearsed it, not because she was lying, but because she had said it many times before. When I asked about Daniel, she said, "His contract ended. We have turnover. Don't scan from the Easterday cabinet until I brief you." That was the first time I heard the name. The Easterday Admission Ledger. The briefing came the next night, 15 minutes before my shift. Margaret handed me a single laminated sheet. White paper, black text, no letterhead, no date. She called it the handling protocol for materials from the Easterday collection. She described the collection as a subset of intake documents from the original Asylum's first superintendent, Dr. Howard Easterday, who had run the facility from 1889 to 1903. She said the materials were historically sensitive and behaviorally reactive to non-compliant handling. She said it the way someone might say a chemical was volatile, not as metaphor, as fact. The sheet listed 8 rules. 1. Never read a patient name aloud if it matches your own. 2. If ink appears wet on any page, stop handling that file immediately and do not touch it again for the remainder of your shift. 3. Do not scan any file dated before L-1895 after midnight. 4. If a file includes a photograph that is not listed in the metadata index, close the file immediately. 5. Never correct handwriting inconsistencies, even if they appear to be transcription errors. 6. If a document records your current action in real time, stop all voluntary movement, including speech and controlled breathing, for exactly 7 minutes. 7. Do not return a file to a drawer that feels warm to the touch. 8. If you hear a second pen writing while you are not writing, leave the room without looking toward the sound. I read the list twice. The rules didn't allow interpretation. They counted things you wouldn't think to count. I looked at Margaret. She was watching me with no particular expression. "This is a joke," I said. "Follow the protocol," she said, "that's all." "Margaret, this reads like a haunted house pamphlet." "It reads like a liability document," she said. "Follow it or terminate your contract. Either is fine." Then she walked out of the archive, and her footsteps faded up the stairwell, and I was alone with the file cabinets and the flatbed and the hum of the fluorescence. My debt was $18,400. My due date was 21 days out. I put on my gloves and opened the Easterday cabinet. The Easterday files were organized in a system I didn't immediately recognize. Not alphabetical, not chronological. They were arranged by what the file labels called admission status, which was broken into 3 categories: pending, active, and resolved. Most of the files were in resolved, which made sense for a collection over a century old. But roughly a dozen were filed under active, and 2 were under pending. One of the pending files had a small adhesive label on the tab, the kind you'd get from a label maker, not handwritten, not 19th century. It was recent, and it said, "Reyes, D." The other said my last name. I opened the Reyes file first. Inside was an admission form identical in format to the one I'd scanned earlier. The same 1890s paper, the same iron gall ink, the same controlled institutional cursive. But it was incomplete. The admission date was filled in. The intake notes were filled in. The line marked assigned ward was filled in. But the field at the bottom labeled status upon admission was blank. Next to it, in Daniel's own felt tip pen, the same one he used on his gloves, was a single annotation. I don't understand who is writing this. That was the last thing Daniel Reyes had written. I could tell because the pen line trailed off into nothing. Not a period, not a completed thought. Just a slow fade, as though his hand had been lifted away from the paper mid-stroke. I put the file down. I looked at the one with my name on it. I didn't open it, not yet. Instead, I started scanning the resolved files, working methodically from the front of the drawer. This was the job. Scan, catalog, move on. The resolved files were ordinary. If you can call 19th century asylum intake documents ordinary. They were structured identically. Patient name, age, county of origin, referring physician, admission date, diagnosis, assigned ward, status upon admission. The diagnoses were the kind of language that belonged to a different century. Moral insanity, puerperal mania, hereditary predisposition. The handwriting was the same across all of them, precise, institutional. The kind of penmanship that belonged to someone who wrote the same forms hundreds of times. By 10:30, I had scanned 14 resolved files without incident. Then I picked up the 15th. The ink was wet, not damp, not slightly tacky from age or humidity. Wet. The way ink is wet when it's been written 30 seconds ago. It sat on top of the paper in a shallow meniscus, and when I tilted the page under the task lamp, it caught the light like a bead of water on glass. Rule 2. If ink appears wet, stop handling that file immediately. I put it down. I slid it back into the drawer. I stepped away, and then I noticed the smell. Iron gall ink has a distinctive scent when it's fresh. Tannic, faintly metallic like the crushed oak bark and rust. I knew the smell because my undergraduate advisor had used the stuff for calligraphy demonstrations. You don't expect to smell it in a modern archive. You certainly don't expect to smell it intensifying. The way a pot of it would smell if someone had just uncapped the bottle 2 feet from your face. The smell was coming from the pending drawer. I looked at the clock. It was 10:47. I had almost 5 hours left on my shift, and I had scanned 14 of what looked like over 300 files. The math on my debt didn't care about wet ink or strange smells. $18,400 has a way of making you practical about things that should make you run. I opened the next resolved file and placed it on the scanner. The file contained a photograph. It was small, maybe 2 by 3 inches, mounted on cardstock with a thin border. The kind of cabinet portrait common in the 1890s. It showed a man in a chair, mid-30s, dark hair, wearing what looked like a hospital gown. His expression was flat. The way subjects looked in long exposure portraits, not quite blank, more like held. The photograph was not listed in the metadata index. I knew this because I had the index open on my screen, and the file number I was scanning had no photograph notation. Rule 4. Close the file immediately. I closed it. I moved on. But here's what I didn't tell you about the photograph. Here's what I noticed in the half second before I shut the folder. The man in the image was sitting in a chair, in a room with a tiled floor and a high window. Behind him on a table was a flatbed scanner, not an object that looked like one, not something I was projecting onto an ambiguous shape. A flatbed scanner, modern, with a green status light glowing on the front panel, in a photograph taken in the 1890s. I stopped scanning at 11:15. I realized I needed someone to explain what I was looking at, and I knew exactly who that had to be. I walked upstairs to the break room. The break room was on the first floor of the modern wing. The wing had been built in the 1980s and still looked like it. Pale blue cinder block walls, a microwave with a turntable that squeaked, a vending machine that sold chips and off-brand granola bars for $1.75. The hallway between the archive stairs and the break room passed through a section of the original 1889 structure, and even at night you could feel the weight difference. The plaster walls were thicker, the ceilings were lower. The air had the kind of coolness that comes from stone, not air conditioning. Margaret Hale was in the break room. She was drinking coffee from a thermos and reading a paperback. And she looked up at me like she'd been waiting. "You scanned from the Easterday cabinet," she said. Not a question. "You told me to. I told you to follow the protocol. I followed it." She studied me for a moment, then closed her book. "Sit down." I sat. She poured coffee from her thermos into a paper cup and pushed it across the table to me. The coffee was lukewarm and bitter, and I drank it because my hands needed something to hold. "How much do you know about Howard Easterday?" she asked. "He was the first superintendent, 1889 to 1901. 1889 to 1903, she corrected. "He stayed 2 years longer than any record officially reflects, because by the end the territorial government couldn't get anyone to replace him. He had built the admission system from scratch. Every form, every classification, every intake protocol. All of it was Easterday. The system didn't just bear his name. It was his logic, his categories, his method of determining who was sane and who was not." She paused and took a sip from her thermos. "Easterday believed that madness was a clerical condition, not medical, clerical. He thought the difference between a sane person and an insane person was a matter of administrative classification. That you weren't sick, you were misfiled. And if you could be correctly filed, correctly documented, correctly entered into the record, then the record would hold. The institution would hold. The patient would hold. He thought the act of documentation was the act of containment." "That's an interesting historical footnote," I said. "What does it have to do with wet ink on a 130-year-old document?" Margaret looked at me without blinking. "The records don't describe the patients. The records make the patients. Easterday's system doesn't document admission. It performs admission. It doesn't change what you are. It decides which version of you gets kept. That's not a metaphor. That's not folklore. That is what happens when you open a pending file and let it finish writing." The fluorescent above us ticked and hummed. The vending machine compressor cycled on with a low rattle. "Daniel figured it out too late," she said. "He tried to annotate his way out of it, tried to write his own notes into the file, as if he could argue with the system. You can't argue with it, you can only follow the protocol." "The protocol delays it," I said. The understanding arrived fully formed, like it had been assembling itself in the back of my mind all night. "The protocol delays it," she confirmed. "It doesn't stop it. Nothing stops it. But if you follow the rules exactly, the file can't complete. It stalls. And at the end of your shift, you close the drawer and you leave. And the file goes back to pending. And if I don't follow the rules, then your file moves from pending to active, and when it's active, it finishes itself. The intake completes. and you become a resolved case. What does resolved mean? Margaret picked up her book and thermos and stood. It means the institution has you. It means you're admitted. It means your record is complete, and complete records don't get released. She walked toward the door, then stopped. You have about 4.5 hours left on your shift. I would spend them carefully. She left. I sat in the break room for 3 minutes, not moving, just breathing and listening to the vending machine compressor rattle against its own housing. Then I went back downstairs. At 11:34, I returned to Station 2 and found that the resolved file I had closed, the one with the anachronistic photograph, was open on the scanner bed. I had closed it. I had put it back. But here it was, open, face up, with the photograph clearly visible under the task lamp. And the photograph had changed. The man in the chair was gone. The chair was empty. The room was the same tiled floor, high window, table with the scanner. But the subject had been removed, not torn out, not obscured. The image simply showed an empty chair now, as though the portrait had been retaken without the patient. I closed the file. I returned it to the drawer. The drawer was warm. Rule 7. Do not return a file to a drawer that feels warm. I pulled the file back out and held it. I couldn't put it on the scanner. The protocol said not to scan pre-1895 files after midnight, and it was close enough that I wasn't going to test it. I couldn't put it in the warm drawer, so I set it on the desk, beside my station, face down, and moved on. At 11:51, I was scanning a resolved file from 1897, safely post-1895, when the text on the page shifted, not all at once. One line at a time, the way a loading screen fills. The patient name at the top of the form was originally Hargrove, LSP, but as I watched, the ink, the same iron gall ink, in the same hand, began to reform. The H softened and stretched. The name was changing. It was becoming mine. I pulled the page off the scanner and held it at arm's length. The ink continued to move, slow and deliberate, each letter reconstituting itself with the care of a clerk, filling out a form for the 100th time. Within 20 seconds, the name field read my name. Below it, the admission date was rewriting itself to today's. I set the page down and didn't touch it again. At 12:03, 3 minutes past midnight, I heard a pen. It wasn't the scratch of old writing. It was the wet, smooth sound of a modern felt tip on paper. It was coming from Station 3, Daniel's station. I was alone in the archive. I knew I was alone because Margaret had left, and there was only one key card active for the basement entrance, and it was in my pocket. Rule 8. If you hear a second pen writing, leave without looking toward the sound. I stood up. I fixed my eyes on the stairwell door at the far end of the room. I did not look at Station 3. I walked to the stairs, opened the door, stepped through, and pulled it shut behind me. I stood in the stairwell, breathing hard, one hand on the cold metal railing. The sound of the pen continued, muffled now by the door. It wrote for 30 seconds, a steady, unhurried rhythm, the sound of someone filling in a form they had filled in many times before. Then it stopped. I waited another 2 minutes. Then I went back in. On the desk at Station 3, where Daniel's gloves still sat folded with the word admitted across the palm, there was a new page. It had not been there before. It was written on the same 1890s admission paper, in the same institutional cursive. It was my file, my pending file, which I had not opened, which I had deliberately avoided touching all night. It was now on Daniel's desk, open, and it was filling in. The admission date was already complete. My name was already complete. My date of birth, my physical description, height, weight, hair color were already complete, and they were accurate. Below that, a field labeled Referring Authority now read, Self-Presented. Below that, diagnosis read, Administrative Continuity Disorder. Subject, Resist classification despite institutional requirement. The field marked Assigned Ward was being written as I watched. The ink moved across the paper in real time, forming letters with the smooth, unhurried precision of a hand that had all the time in the world. It wrote, East Wing, Room 11. Below that, the field labeled Status Upon Admission was still blank. That was the last field. The one that had been blank in Daniel's file, too. I understood with a clarity that felt less like realization and more like something being stamped into the front of my mind, that if that last field completed, I was done. The file would be active. The file would then be resolved, and resolved records don't get released. I remembered Rule 6. If a document records your current action, stop all voluntary movement, including speech and controlled breathing, for exactly 7 minutes. Was it recording my current action? It had described me as self-presented. It was filling in my physical details. It was assigning me a ward. If that wasn't a real-time record of what was happening, I didn't know what was. I stopped moving. I stood perfectly still at Station 3, my hands at my sides, my eyes fixed on the page. I held my breath for as long as I could, then released it as slowly and shallowly as possible, trying to make my lungs invisible to whatever was watching. The ink paused. It had been mid-letter in the Status Upon Admission field. I could see the first downstroke of a capital letter, just the faintest beginning of a curve, and it stopped. The pen sound, which had been so subtle I'd only registered it as a background pressure, went silent. 7 minutes. 420 seconds, not approximately. Exactly. I counted in my head. I counted each second because I had nothing else to hold on to. At 60, I said 1, silently. At 120, I said 2. The archive was silent around me. The fluorescent tubes hummed their toothacheing hum. The drop ceiling tiles absorbed every other sound into a flat, dead quiet. The ink on the page did not move. The air did not change. Nothing happened at all for 7 minutes, and that nothing was worse than everything that had come before. Because it meant the system was listening. It was waiting. It was counting the same seconds I was. And the rules it followed were more precise than anything I could manage. Standing still in a basement with my heart slamming against my ribs. At 6 minutes and 58 seconds, though I believed it was 7 minutes, though I would have sworn it under oath, I exhaled. Not a gasp, not a deliberate breath. Just the kind of exhale your body forces when it has been holding tension for too long, the kind of breath that feels involuntary but isn't. Not according to Rule 6, not according to the system. The ink moved. Not fast, but it moved. The downstroke that had paused resumed its path, curving into what would become a letter, then a word, then a sentence. I watched it write for about 3 seconds before I grabbed the page and flipped it face down. The ink didn't stop. I could hear it, the nib scratching against the underside of the paper, writing blind, writing through the page if it had to. I slammed the sheet onto the scanner bed at Station 2 and pressed the glass lid down on top of it, trapping it between the glass and the light bar. The scratching continued for a moment, muffled by the glass, and then it stopped. Not because it was done, because it was waiting again. The file had stalled, but it hadn't stopped. The field was still incomplete. I could see through the glass a faint, wet gleam where the ink had been working. But whatever it had been writing, it hadn't finished the sentence. The paper was warm under the glass. Body temperature warm. The way something is warm when it's been held in someone's hand. At 12:22, I opened the next resolved file. The page was blank. Completely blank. The paper was there. Old, fibrous, stained at the edges. But there was no text, no ink, no handwriting. Just empty fields with faint printed labels. Name, date, diagnosis, ward, status, all blank. And then, starting from the top, ink began to appear. The same hand. The same deliberate pace. It began writing a name I didn't recognize. A new name. Someone who hadn't arrived yet. I closed the file. At 12:40, the temperature in the archive dropped. Not gradually, it fell the way it does when someone opens an exterior door in winter. My breath didn't fog, but I could feel the cold on the skin of my forearms below my rolled sleeves. The flatbed scanner's glass surface went from warm to noticeably cool under my gloved fingertips. And then I heard footsteps. They came from beyond the file cabinets, from the far side of the room where the old foundation wall formed a dead end. There was nothing back there. No door, no corridor, just stone and cinder block. But the footsteps were clear, deliberate, institutional. Hard-soled shoes on tile, even though the floor was carpeted. They walked at the pace of someone being escorted, measured, unhurried. The way you walk when the person beside you has your arm, and there's nowhere to go but forward. They stopped. Then, from the same direction, came the sound of a heavy door closing. Not slamming. Closing. The way a door closes when someone pulls it shut carefully behind them. The latch catching with a solid mechanical click. And then a lock turning. There was no door there. At 1:15, the file under the scanner lid moved. I felt it through the glass. A shift, like someone had nudged the paper from beneath. I lifted the lid. My pending file was exactly where I'd left it, face down. But a new line of text had appeared on the back. Just one sentence, written in the same iron gall hand. The patient is aware processing and is displaying non-compliant behavior. I put the lid back down. At 1:38, every drawer in the Easterday cabinet opened at once, not violently. Smoothly, evenly, with the mechanical precision of a filing system being accessed by someone who knew exactly where everything went. The drawers slid out to their full extension, and inside each one, I could see the files rearranging. They moved on their own, shuffling forward and back, resorting themselves as though an invisible clerk were refiling the entire collection. The tabs flickered with new labels. Some of the resolved files moved to active. One of the active files moved to pending. The sound they made was papery and dry, like a librarian working very quickly. Underneath that sound, so faint I almost missed it, was the creak of a wooden chair, as if someone, somewhere in the building, had just sat down when the drawers slid shut again. All at once, in unison, the cabinet was still. I approached it. I pulled open the pending drawer. There were now 3 files, Reyes, mine, and a third with a new label, a name I didn't recognize. Someone else. The next contractor, maybe, or the one after that. At 2:10, I went upstairs. Margaret Hale was in the hallway outside the break room, standing under the fluorescent light, with her thermos in one hand and her key card in the other, as though she had been walking somewhere specific and decided to wait instead. "How many?" I asked. She didn't ask what I meant. "Since I started supervising, 7. Before me, I don't know. The records don't track supervisors, only patients." "Daniel makes 7? "Daniel makes 6. You're 7. I leaned against the cinder block wall. The stone was cold through my shirt. "Why do you do this?" "Because someone has to manage the collection. If no one digitizes, no one is in the archive. If no one is in the archive, the system has no intake. If the system has no intake..." She paused, not for drama, but like she was choosing the most accurate word. "It reaches out further. The pending files don't stay in the cabinet. They start appearing in other collections, other institutions, other archives. I've seen it happen once, in 2014, before I understood what the protocol was for. A file from the Easterday Ledger turned up in a university library in Tucson. A graduate student opened it. She was admitted within the week. Nobody found her. Nobody knew where to look, because nobody knew the system existed. So you feed it, you cycle contractors in to keep it contained. I give it a structured intake process," she said. "That's what it wants. It was built to admit. Easterday designed it to admit. When it has an orderly process, files, drawers, protocol, staff, it follows the rules. And the rules can be delayed. The protocol works. Follow it and the file never completes. Until it does." Margaret looked at me. "Daniel stopped following the rules at 3 a.m. on a Thursday. He thought if he wrote in the file himself, he could override the system, annotate his way out. He picked up a pen and wrote a question in the margin of his own intake form. The file interpreted it as patient self-reporting. It completed in under a minute." "And what happened to Daniel?" She didn't answer. She took a sip from her thermos and looked at the wall behind my head. "Room 11, I said. "East wing. My file says I'm assigned to room 11. That room has been sealed since 1967. There's no door on the far wall of the archive." "There is now," she said. "For you." I looked at her for a long time. The hallway was empty. The building above us was silent. The modern wards were on the north side, and the archive wing was on the south. And there was no sound between them except stone and plaster and the hum of old wiring. "What happens if I walk out right now? Get in my car, drive to Albuquerque. Never come back. The file is active. You moved during the 7 minutes." Everything inside me went cold. I didn't. I counted to 4:20, 7 minutes exactly. You exhaled. At 4:20. The file records exhalation as voluntary movement. You were at 6 minutes and 58 seconds. 2 seconds. I had been 2 seconds short. Once active, the file completes itself regardless of location. The only variable is where you're admitted. If you leave, the system admits you wherever you are. A hospital, a shelter, a parking lot. The file doesn't care. It just needs to resolve. But if you're here, in the building, in the original wing, the intake is, she paused again, clean. It follows Easterday's process. There's a room. There's a chair. The file closes and the record is complete, and the system is satisfied. The protocol holds for the next person. And if I refuse, then the next contractor's file starts active instead of pending. No rules, no protocol, no delay. Immediate resolution. That was the cost. That was what Margaret was offering, and what she had always been offering, to every contractor who sat in the basement and wore cotton gloves and scanned dead people's intake forms at $42 an hour. She was offering them to the system. In exchange, the system stayed in the cabinet, followed the rules, and gave the next person a chance. I thought about Pershel. I thought about my debt. I thought about the fact that $18,400 doesn't matter to a man who has been administratively classified as a patient in a building that was built 3 years before his great-grandparents were born. "Show me the room," I said. Margaret led me through the original wing. We passed through the section where the plaster walls were thickest, and the ceiling dropped to 7 feet. The hallway narrowed until my shoulders nearly touched both sides. The lights here weren't fluorescent. They were caged bulbs, the kind they used to install in institutional corridors to prevent patients from breaking them. They cast a yellow light that made the walls look damp even though they weren't. The air was different here, heavier. It tasted the way old paper smells, tannic, fibrous, preserved. At the end of the corridor, there was a door. It was wooden, heavy, with a small observation window at head height. Thick glass, wired through with a diamond mesh. The number on the door was painted in white block numerals. 11. The paint was old. The door was not. The door itself was clearly original. The wood was dark with age. The hinges were iron. The latch was the kind of heavy bolt mechanism that belonged to the 1890s, but it hadn't been there before. The corridor I was standing in had been a dead end when I'd walked through it earlier that night. Now it ended in a door, as though the building had remembered a room it had forgotten and grown it back. Margaret unlocked the latch with a key from her pocket. Not a key card. A physical key, black iron, the kind that belongs to a lock made before electricity was standard in New Mexico. The room was small, 10 feet by 10 feet maybe, tile floor, white hexagonal tile, the same kind you see in old institutional bathrooms, cracked in places, grouted with something that had gone dark with age. A high window, frosted, with iron bars on the outside. A single chair in the center of the room, wooden, straight-backed with armrests. No table, no scanner, no modern anything, except on the floor beside the chair my file. It was open, it was nearly complete. Every field was filled in. Name, date, diagnosis, ward, referring authority, physical description. All accurate, all in the same 19th century hand. The only blank field was the last one. Status upon admission. I sat in the chair. The wood was cold. The armrests were worn smooth in the places where hands had rested before. Slight depressions in the grain, left by fingers that had gripped the same spot for hours, or days, or longer. I set my hands into the grooves. They fit. Margaret stood in the doorway. "When it's done," she said, "you won't feel any different. You'll just be filed." She didn't say sorry. She didn't look away. She watched me the way a clerk watches a form being processed, with the attentive disinterest of someone whose job is to make sure the paperwork is correct. The ink began to move. I could hear it now. Not the felt-tip sound from the archive, but the original sound. The scratch of a metal nib on paper. The slight catch where the iron gall ink snagged on the fiber. It wrote slowly, carefully. One letter at a time. The pen scratching slower with each word, like it was finishing something important, something it wanted to get exactly right. In the last field of my file, in the same hand that had built this entire system 131 years ago, it wrote, "Admitted, voluntary, compliant." The ink dried. The file was complete. The door closed. I heard the latch. I heard the lock turn, that same solid mechanical click I'd heard from across the archive hours ago when I thought it was coming from a door that didn't exist. I heard Margaret's footsteps retreating down the corridor, growing fainter, the hard soles on old tile counting off a rhythm that sounded almost like a clerk's pen tapping the edge of an inkwell. Then the stairwell door. Then nothing. I'm still in the chair. My hands are still resting in the grooves of the armrests, fingers settled into the depressions left by everyone who sat here before me. My back is straight against the wood. My breathing has slowed into something even and unhurried. The way you breathe when you've stopped expecting anything to change. The light through the frosted window is starting to shift, a pale movement that could be dawn, though I'm no longer certain this room has a dawn. The file is on the floor beside me, closed now. On the tab I can see that someone, or something, has moved it from pending to resolved. My name is on the label. My dates are on the form. Everything is in order. Everything always was. I never said my name aloud, not once. I followed that rule perfectly. But the Easterday Admission Ledger never needed me to say it. The record was complete before I understood what it was recording. And somewhere in the archive below, in the pending drawer of a cabinet that has been admitting patients since 1889, a new tab is being printed.